Welcome to Lessons of the Game podcast. I am your host, Jay Thabit, and I am the storyteller. Thanks for joining me. Today, we dive deep into a two-part saga of two infamous street legends. Every city has an underbelly or underworld, and in Harlem, two names echoed louder than any others. The names Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas. This podcast will cover their rise, fall, and their redemption. This story is titled The Godfathers of Harlem. For part one, we will be diving into the life of Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, who was an American crime boss in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. For part two, we will follow up with the story of Bumpy's prodigy, the legendary Frank Lucas. Let's get into it. Part one. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina on October 31st, 1905 to Margaret Moultrie and William Johnson. When he was 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Afraid of a possible lynch mob, his parents mortgaged their tiny home to get enough funds together to send Bumpy to New York to live with relatives. Johnson's nickname Bumpy is derived from a bump on the back of his head. As Johnson grew older, his parents worried about his short temper and his insolence towards white people. In 1919, he was sent to live with his older sister Mabel in Harlem. Johnson dropped out of high school and began working in dead-end jobs. Gangster William Hewitt noticed Johnson had heart, so he brought him on where he began working for him, beginning his life of crime. Born into poverty, Bumpy learned early on that survival meant playing a different game, a game with higher stakes and even higher consequences. He navigated the unforgiving streets with precision, using his mind as a weapon sharper than any blade. He rose through the ranks, seizing control of the numbers racket. Gambling dens became his domain, his influence undeniable. Johnson was an associate of numbers Queen Madame Stephanie St. Clair. He became St. Clair's principal lieutenant in the 1930s. Johnson and St. Clair aimed to start a war against New York mob boss Dutch Schultz. The fight resulted in more than 40 murders and several kidnappings. Eventually, the fight on their end was lost, ending with a deal for Johnson. Johnson was arrested more than 40 times and served 2 prison terms for narcotics-related charges. In December 1965, Johnson staged a sit-down strike in a police station, refusing to leave as a protest against their continued surveillance. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station, but was acquitted by a judge. One of the most intriguing aspects of Bumpy Johnson's reign was his unconventional alliance with Malcolm X. Despite their different backgrounds and philosophies, they found common ground in their desire to protect Harlem. Together, they took on the street gangs, hoodlums, and the Italian mafia. Their partnership was a powerful force, blending Bumpy's street smarts with Malcolm's charismatic leadership. They had a common goal to clean up Harlem, fighting for a Harlem free from external control and internal chaos. But don't be mistaken, Bumpy's rise to power was marked by violence and craftiness, outmaneuvered rivals, paid off cops, and built an empire that extended beyond Harlem. He was a kingpin, a man both feared and respected, but with power came enemies, and Bumpy had plenty. It should be noted that Malcolm X eventually decided his association with a known criminal might damage his image and asked Bumpy to stand down his guards. Tragically, Malcolm X was assassinated only weeks later, leaving behind a legacy of activism and struggle against injustice. Bumpy was publicly accused of several violent crimes. In the 1940s, he was implicated in the brutal murder of a rival numbers runner. This act sent a clear message. Bumpy Johnson was not to be trifled with. He was also linked to the infamous Harlem riots of 1943, where he was accused of inciting violence and looting, although these charges were never proven. Another instance, Bumpy was alleged to have orchestrated the ambush and murder of a rival gang leader who dared to encroach on his territory. His brutality knew no bounds, and these violent acts only cemented his reputation as a formidable and feared figure in the underworld. As the years went by, the FBI and local law enforcement ramped up their efforts to take down Harlem's underworld. Bumpy was arrested numerous times, but his legal acumen and connections kept him out of prison. However, in the 1950s, the heat intensified. Bumpy faced numerous charges, from drug trafficking to extortion. In 1952, Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years in Alcatraz for a heroin conspiracy. The king of Harlem was behind bars, but his legend only grew. Even in prison, Bumpy maintained his influence, orchestrating deals and keeping his empire intact. Bumpy Johnson was released in 1963, returning to a changed Harlem. The world had moved on, but Bumpy's presence was still felt. He tried to reclaim his throne, but the game had changed. New players had emerged and the streets were different. Bumpy Johnson married Mamie Hatcher in October 1948, only 6 months after their first meeting. Johnson had 2 daughters, Ruthie and Elise, the latter of whom was from another relationship. His wife died in May 2009 at the age of 96. Johnson was under a federal indictment for drug conspiracy when he died of a heart attack on July 7, 1968 at the age of 62. He was at Wells Restaurant in Harlem shortly before 2 a.m. The waitress had just served him a coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits when he fell over clutching his chest. He is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York City. Bumpy Johnson was a true criminal mastermind who mastered his craft. His net worth at death topped an estimated $50 million. Yes, you heard me right. I said $50 million. Okay, so now that I got you familiar with Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, let's get right into part 2. But first, let me say, if you made it this far, thanks for joining me. You're now tuned into the Lessons of the Game podcast, and I am your host, Jay Thabit, the storyteller. In part 2 of this episode, we continue our journey through the underworld of Harlem, focusing on another crime boss, and that's Mr. Frank Lucas, the man who inherited the throne from Bumpy Johnson. This is the story of his rise and fall. Frank Lucas was born and raised in LaGrange, North Carolina, a suburb of Goldsboro, North Carolina, to Fred and Mahalie Jones. Lucas, he said the incident that motivated him to embark on a life of crime was him witnessing his 12-year-old cousin's murder at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan for smiling at a white woman. The story goes as such. When Frank was a 6-year-old boy, he watched his 12-year-old cousin get shot in the mouth by the Klan after they had tied him to a pole. Frank said that the Klan came to his house, which was located in the backwoods near LaGrange, North Carolina. They accused his cousin of eyeballing a white girl who was walking down the street. They tied ropes on each hand and then pulled them tight in opposite directions. Then they shoved a shotgun in his cousin's mouth and pulled the trigger. Frank said that this moment caused him to begin his life of crime. He drifted through a life of petty crime until one occasion when he got into a fight with a former employer with whose daughter he had been having an affair. In the fight, Lucas hit the father on the head with a pipe, knocking him unconscious. He then stole $400 from the company safe and set the establishment on fire. Later, Frank fled to New York City at the request of his mother, who feared that he would either be imprisoned for life or lynched. Once in Harlem, he quickly began indulging in petty crimes and pool hustling before he was taken under the wing of gangster Bumpy Johnson. After Johnson's death, Lucas traveled around and came to the realization that to be successful, he would have to break the monopoly that the mafia held in New York. Frank Lucas revolutionized the heroin trade. He bypassed the traditional Italian mafia, going directly to the source in Southeast Asia. He used American military planes to smuggle heroin into the United States, hidden in the coffins of soldiers returning from the Vietnam War. It was a bold, ingenious move that earned him millions and solidified his position as a drug kingpin. Frank's Blue Magic heroin was pure, cheap, and flooded the streets of Harlem. He built an empire that rivaled Bumpy's, living a life of luxury and excess. He stated his heroin, Blue Magic, was 98 to 100% pure when shipped from Thailand. Lucas has been quoted as saying that his worth was something like $52 million, most of it in Cayman Islands banks. Frank's rise to power was quick and fruitful, but it came at a cost. His success attracted the wrong attention, not just from rivals, but from the authorities as well. Rumor has it, Frank's ruthlessness knew no bounds. When a federal agent started getting too close, it was said that Frank sent a clear message by blowing up the agent's car. The explosion was a bold, violent statement, a reminder that Frank Lucas was a man not to be trifled with. It was this kind of audacity that kept law enforcement on their toes and cemented Frank's fearsome reputation. The DEA and NYPD launched an intensive investigation into Frank's operation. He was betrayed by those closest to him, and the noose began to tighten. In 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested in a dramatic raid on his New Jersey mansion. The evidence was damning, and Frank faced life in prison. When interviewed for a New York Magazine article published in 2000, Lucas stated that he flew with a North Carolina carpenter to Bangkok. Frank is reported as saying, "We did it all right. Who the hell is going to look in a dead soldier's coffin?" We had him make up 28 copies of the government coffins, except we fixed them up with fake bottoms big enough to load up with 6, maybe 8 kilos. It had to be snug. You couldn't have shit sliding around. My guy was very smart because he made sure we used heavy guys' coffins. He did not put them in any skinny guys' coffins. However, Atkinson, nicknamed Sergeant Smack, Frank Lucas's smuggler, told the Drug Enforcement Administration that he shipped drugs in furniture, not caskets. Atkinson, who has since came out with his own book titled Sergeant Smack, The Legendary Lives and Times of Ike Atkinson, Kingpin, and His Band of Brothers. In his book, Atkinson claims that Frank Lucas is a liar and that he was the mastermind behind smuggling drugs into the United States and that Lucas used to buy his drugs from him. Atkinson claims Lucas's story is of his life and that Lucas invented the story of military soldier coffins. Now, if you're wondering if Atkinson could be telling the truth or not, we first have to ask ourselves, who was Sergeant Smack? According to the DEA and court records, Atkinson, Sergeant Smack, under the cover of the Vietnam War and through the use of the U.S. military infrastructure, masterminded an enterprising group of family members and former African-American GIs that the DEA identified as one of history's 10 top drug trafficking rings. Ike's organization moved heroin from Thailand to North Carolina and beyond. According to law enforcement sources, 1,000 pounds is a conservative estimate of the amount of heroin the ring transported annually from Bangkok, Thailand, through U.S. military bases into the U.S. during its period of operation from 1968 to 1975. Atkinson and his brothers moved about $400 million worth of illegal drug sales during that period. It should also be known that when Frank Lucas agreed to work with the Fed, Atkinson's name was one of the over 100 dealers he snitched on, even in Mamie Johnson's book. Bumpy Johnson's wife wrote in her book titled Harlem's Godfather that Lucas has fantasized his story and that his story is that of another dealer. She has said that her husband didn't trust Lucas and treated him like a flunky. Whatever method he used, Lucas will be forever known as the American drug lord that smuggled drugs into the United States with a direct link from Asia. Lucas said that he made $1 million per day selling drugs on 116th Street, though this was later discovered to be an exaggeration. Federal Judge Sterling Johnson, who was the special narcotics prosecutor for the city of New York at the time of Lucas's crimes, called Lucas's operation one of the most outrageous international dope smuggling gangs ever, an innovator who got his own connections outside the U.S. and then sold the narcotics himself in the street. It was widely known that Lucas trusted only relatives and close friends from North Carolina to handle his various heroin operations. Lucas thought they were less likely to steal from him and not be so tempted by various vices in the big city. Lucas is reported to have said he easily could move 1,000 keys or 2,200 pounds of dope he had on hand with a potential profit of no less than $300,000 per kilo. This huge profit margin allowed him to buy property all over the country, including office buildings in Detroit and apartments in Los Angeles and Miami. He also bought a ranch of several thousand acres in North Carolina on which he ranged 300 head of Black Angus cattle, including a breeding bull worth $125,000. Lucas rubbed shoulders with the elite of the entertainment, political, and criminal worlds, stating later that he had met Howard Hughes at one of Harlem's best clubs in his day. Though he owned several mink and chinchilla coats and other accessories, Lucas much preferred to dress casually and corporately so as not to attract attention to himself. When he was arrested in the mid-1970s, all of Lucas' assets were seized. The properties in Chicago, Detroit, Miami, North Carolina, Puerto Rico, they took everything. Lucas has said, "My lawyer told me they couldn't take the money in the offshore accounts. I trusted that. I had all my money stored in the Cayman Islands, but that's BS. They can take it. Take my word for it. If you got something, hide it, because they can go to any bank and take it." In January 1975, Lucas's house in Teaneck, New Jersey, was raided by a task force consisting of 10 agents from Group 22 of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and 10 New York Police Department detectives attached to the Organized Crime Control Bureau. In his house, authorities found $500,000 in cash, but Lucas said that the officers that executed the search warrant departed with a full $11 million temporarily stored in his attic, and that the feds only documented around 5% of the currency they seized. He was later convicted of both federal and New Jersey state drug violations and was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Once arrested, Lucas provided evidence that led to more than 100 further drug-related convictions. Damn, he was telling on everyone. For his safety in 1977, Lucas and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program. After doing only 5 years for telling on all of Harlem, he gets out, and again, in 1981, he gets caught up again, and this time was convicted of trying to exchange 1 ounce of heroin and $13,000 for 1 kilogram of cocaine. He received a sentence of 7 years and was released from prison in 1991. Again, in 2012, while living in Newark, he pleaded guilty to attempting to cash a $17,000 federal disability benefit check twice. Due to his advanced age and his poor health, which included his restriction to a wheelchair, prosecutors agreed to a sentence of 5 years probation. After his release, Frank Lucas sought redemption. He publicly spoke about his past, acknowledging the harm he had caused to his community and the lives he had destroyed. He expressed remorse for his actions and vowed to use his experience to deter others from following in his footsteps. In his later years, Frank Lucas lived a quieter life, away from the spotlight of his criminal past. He focused on his family and sought solace in religion. Despite his tumultuous journey, Frank Lucas found a semblance of peace in his efforts to make amends. Frank Lucas passed away in 2019, leaving behind a complex legacy of crime, redemption, and determination. His story serves as a reminder of the consequences of choices and the possibility of transformation. This concludes part 2, titled Frank Lucas, the American Drug Lord. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the lives of the Godfathers of Harlem. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, the lessons of the game are often learned the hard way. Stay tuned for more stories of rise, fall, and redemption. Until next time, I'm your host, Jay Thabit, the storyteller.